Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. We are in lesson 60 of the Gospel of Matthew. We're covering Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 through 31, and this one's called Moment by Moment on Crucifixion Day. Matthew does not tell us any additional specifics of what occurred after the arrest of Jesus and questioning by Caiaphas at the home of his father-in-law, Annas. The next information that we can read about occurs the next morning when the Jewish religious leaders bind Jesus and lead him away to Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor. Pilate did not live in Jerusalem, but did have a home there. His headquarters were in Caesarea, a fortress on the Mediterranean Sea built by Herod. Pilate was in Jerusalem because it was the week of the Passover feast, and once again, Jews were required to attend the feast in Jerusalem each year. Consequently, Jerusalem was packed. We also need to recall the tenuous relationship that existed between the Romans and the Jews within the nation of Israel, and most specifically within the city of Jerusalem. Jewish zealots continuously battled against Roman rule. With additional people in Jerusalem, unrest was even more prevalent. So Pontius Pilate was in Jerusalem to keep riots under control. It is interesting that many disbelieving historians stated that there was no historical record of Pontius Pilate. But in 1961, an archaeologist discovered a limestone block in Caesarea that both mentions and identifies Pontius Pilate as the Roman prefect of Judea, who dedicated a temple to the deified Tiberius. This once again proves that the Bible is an accurate historical document. One of these days, the same will occur with Noah's Ark. If most of us were facing an event of the magnitude that Jesus was facing, we would have been up all night worrying. While I doubt that Jesus was sleeping that night, I would guess he was praying without ceasing. Let's read our first passage. Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 through 2 says this: When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. The Jewish religious leaders have been plotting against Jesus for a rather lengthy time. What was different on this morning, the morning after the arrest of Jesus? Remember, the Jews did not have the power to either give a sentence of death or enforce a sentence of death. Knowing that they must hand Jesus over to the Romans, and specifically to Pontius Pilate, it is very likely that this was a brainstorming session trying to figure out how to get Pontius Pilate to do their bidding, to do what they desired. I would surmise that these Jewish religious leaders felt a bit of fear in their unwavering pursuit of this death sentence for Jesus. The Romans were capable of taking matters into their own hands, and these Jewish religious leaders could be punished for breaking the Roman law in their arrest of Jesus. Let's read the next passage. Matthew chapter 27, verses 3 through 10 says this: Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, What is that to us? You see to it. Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed, and went and hanged himself. But the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, because they are the price of blood. And they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me." Matthew 27, verse 3 specifically states that Judas saw that Jesus had been condemned. That tells us that Judas was there also. If Judas saw Jesus, then we can assume that Jesus also saw Judas. The betrayal by Judas was an egregious sin, but that does not mean that it was unforgivable. We can think of at least 3 times when Judas had the opportunity to ask Jesus for his forgiveness. The first would have been at the Last Supper, when Jesus identified Judas as the one who would betray him. At that time, the action of betrayal had not yet occurred, but that betrayal already existed within the heart of Judas. Having been confronted by Jesus at that moment, Judas could have admitted the evil that was in his heart and asked Jesus for forgiveness at that time. A few hours later, when Judas identified Jesus with a kiss, accompanied by an armed mob representing the Jewish religious authorities, Jesus referred to Judas as friend and asked what he was doing there. That was a second opportunity for Judas to ask for forgiveness. And now we see the third opportunity when Judas sees that Jesus has been condemned. Matthew states that Judas was remorseful. The saddest part of this is that remorseful is not the same as repentant. We often see this in murder trials, even today. After a jury finds a person guilty of murder, we regularly will see that convicted defendant crying their eyes out. But notice they are not crying for the loss of the person they have killed. Instead, most are simply crying for their personal loss of freedom. Most of us have experienced betrayal. It is one thing to betray a friend, and quite another to betray God or betray the Son of God. When we betray a friend, it is wrong, but as friends are just as fallible and sinful as we are, we can at least come up with an excuse, even if it is not a valid one. But to betray Jesus, who is without sin, without evil, and personally selected Judas as one of his disciples, it is easy to see why Judas would be remorseful. Judas even stated, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But feeling sorry for ourselves is not the same as repentance. Judas no longer wanted the bribe money that the Jewish religious leaders had paid him, and tossed those 30 pieces of silver back at the chief priest and elders. They didn't care. It was not the money they were concerned with, and they had gotten exactly what they wanted out of Judas already. The religious leaders took that money and purchased a field where strangers would be buried, called the Field of Blood, Akel Dama. Judas hanged himself and died on that day before Jesus. There are passages in the Bible when Jesus compared some of the cities where he did much of his ministry to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and stated that Sodom and Gomorrah will be judged less harshly than the cities where the ministry of Jesus took place. That makes me wonder who will be judged more harshly, Judas or the Jewish religious leaders. I would guess the latter, based on the fact that Judas showed remorse. Once again, if Judas had just asked Jesus for forgiveness, Jesus would have forgiven him. This should be a reminder to each of us that no matter how much shame that we feel because of sins we have committed, Jesus is still willing to forgive us. Let's read the next passage. Matthew chapter 27, verses 11 through 14 says this. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. We can see the plot of the Jewish religious leaders in this opening statement by Pontius Pilate. The Jewish religious leaders wanted Jesus dead because in their perception, they viewed Jesus as blasphemous. This had to do with his statements identifying himself as the Son of God and also his claims to have the power to forgive sin. None of these accusations would have held any water with Pontius Pilate, as there were no crimes against Rome being committed, even if Jesus had made these claims falsely. The charge that the Jewish religious leaders came up with that had a chance of convincing Pontius Pilate involved sedition against Rome. They accused Jesus of claiming that he was the king of the Jews, and in that claim had elevated himself above Roman rule. When Pilate asked Jesus about this, Jesus freely admitted that he was the king of the Jews. We also should notice that Jesus does not defend himself against any charges from the Jewish leaders, but he often does respond to Pontius Pilate. Jesus fulfilled this prophecy from Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. As believers, there are lessons to be learned here. First of all, one of the reasons that Jesus did not defend himself is that the false accusations of his detractors did not matter simply because the cross was what he came to do. This was his purpose and his plan. It would have made no sense for Jesus to defend himself to the point where they would have released him. The prophecies all would be fulfilled. But we also should do a bit of self-reflection and think of the numerous times when we get caught up in defending ourselves. Isn't God capable of defending his children? I'm not saying that it is sinful to defend ourselves, but at the same time, just as Job fell into self-righteousness, we can do the same thing when we are more concerned with defending our own honor. Instead, we should care more about defending God. Pontius Pilate marveled at the strength of Jesus. Let's read the next passage. Matthew chapter 27, verses 15 through 26 says this. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, Which of the two do you want me to release to you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? They all said to him, Let him be crucified. Then the governor said, Why? What evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And all the people answered and said, His blood be on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Pontius Pilate felt trapped. He did not see any reason to sentence Jesus to death. What Pilate was most concerned with at this time was for Jerusalem not to break into riots, which would reflect poorly on Pilate's ability to rule the people in the way he had been called to by Caesar. As stated earlier, it always was a tenuous relationship between the Romans and the Jews, who desired to have autonomy in their own land. Feast weeks always were the most challenging, as the population greatly increased. Every Passover, Pilate would release one of the Jewish prisoners. And even though the Jewish religious leaders had trumped up the charges against Jesus, Pilate thought that his way out of this awkward situation was to have the crowd of Jewish people choose Jesus as the prisoner to be released. Pilate placed Jesus against a man named Barabbas for that choice, and Barabbas was a notorious prisoner, a repeat offender. In Hebrew, Barabbas means son of the Father, which is quite ironic in that Jesus was the greatest son of the greatest Father. The chief priests and elders encouraged the mob to ask for the release of Barabbas, with whispers behind the scenes. Pilate's wife advised her husband beforehand that a dream had alerted her not to have anything to do with this. The crowd chose to have Barabbas released, and then asked for Jesus to be crucified. What we should notice is that a death sentence is not something that the crowd had the ability to pass down. This was Pilate's decision, and Pilate's alone. But in his concern to keep the mob under control, Pilate relented to their decisions. But notice that Pilate asks the crowd, why? What evil has he done? Pilate brought water out and washed his hands symbolically, demonstrating that he was innocent of this blood that was to be spilled. But even with this symbolic gesture, Pilate did not go down in history as an innocent man. Instead, he is remembered in the Apostles' Creed, repeated by congregations in many churches, and it clearly states that Jesus Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate. The response by the multitude, described by Matthew as all the people, was, "His blood be on us and on our children." Well, that would occur. After the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, there were not many Jews who would come to salvation through Jesus Christ. And within a generation, the temple would be destroyed, and the surviving Jews would be sent away from Israel. In earlier passages, we can see that Jesus said that their eyes had been blinded. God sent Jesus to save his chosen people, the Jews. Because the Jews did not receive him, the offer of salvation went to the Gentiles. And it would not be until the fullness of the Gentiles would be accomplished that God's offer of salvation would return to the Jews as a focus. Let's read our final passage today. Matthew chapter 27, verses 27 through 31 says this, "And the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole garrison around him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews.' Then they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off him and put his clothes on him and led him away to be crucified." Even though Pilate did not want to put Jesus to death, the Roman soldiers seemed to enjoy their part to play. Either they loved torturing others, or there was a satanic influence that caused them to treat Jesus more brutally than any other prisoner. They mocked him, ridiculed him, spat on him, struck him in the head, and all that after Jesus had been scourged. Beaten so brutally, and he bled so much that no one would have recognized him as Jesus, or quite literally, as a man. This occurred at Pilate's headquarters in Jerusalem, also referred to as the Praetorium or Antonio Fortress. This was very close to the Via Dolorosa, which means the way of suffering. Catholic tradition identifies 14 stations of the cross, commemorating this perceived passage of Jesus on that day. In some excavated flooring of the Antonio Fortress, etchings are still visible in the floor where soldiers would have cast lots for the clothing of Jesus. Notice that Jesus remains in the moment. We tend to be either dreamers or worriers. Neither dreamers or worriers are satisfied with the present. Worriers become paralyzed, uncertain of what will happen next. Often it is completely wasted time, worrying of events that never will happen. Dreamers are always looking for something better. Jesus knew where he came from, knew where he was, and knew where he was going. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed 3 times that if there was any other way for this cup to pass from him, but only in the Lord's will, this seems to be the only time when Jesus was looking ahead to getting this major task behind him. But it still did not pass into worry. We are reminded by Paul in Philippians 4:6 to be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Jesus spent lots of time in prayer, in direct communication with the Father. The cross was not just a small task, but a major one. But Jesus remained on course, not just directionally, but also moment by moment. It is so difficult to completely understand the miracle of the gift that Jesus offered at the cross. He did what we could not do, and he did what we never would have chosen to do. Sacrificial love takes love to another level. Paul reminds us that husbands are to love their wives as Jesus loves the church. That is sacrificially. Sacrificial love is the willingness of giving up everything because of the love of another. We can look at that love and think that it is something we are incapable of doing. But Jesus gave us the example. It would be one thing to offer that kind of love to someone who loved us in return, and quite another to offer that love to those who looked upon us with disdain. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus was willing to do this for the biggest sinner, the one who hated him most. It breaks my heart that the majority of people are unable to accept the gift that Jesus has given to each of us if we are simply willing to receive. That doesn't take a lot of work on our parts, but because of arrogance, ignorance, and mostly just pride, many people never will accept the love of Jesus. There's nothing greater. As followers of him, we should also follow his example of staying in the moment. Don't worry about tomorrow, as tomorrow will bring its own concerns. Don't be stumbled by the past. It doesn't really matter where we came from. All that matters is where we're going. And if we stay in the present, we can love those around us in a way that might change their lives as much as God has changed our lives. As servants of God, we should desire to demonstrate the love of Jesus to others. It is all because of the cross that we're able to offer that love. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.